This episode may contain sensitive language not suitable for children. Hello, and welcome back to Season 2 of Through Black Eyes Unfiltered, the podcast that brings truth to light. Listen to present-day historical events that shaped our history and will determine our future, as presented by moderator Raymond Dunn and expert Marvin Dunn.
I am Dr. Marvin Dunn. I'm the author of several books dealing with black history in Florida. The first book was on the Miami Riot of 1980, Crossing the Bounds. It was written by myself and Bruce Porter. I've also written Black Miami in the 20th Century, and it deals with the history of lynching in Florida. And my latest book is called A History of Florida Through Black Eyes, and it traces the history of blacks in Florida from the arrival of black people with the Spanish. These books are available on Amazon.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Through Black Eyes Unfiltered, the Black Seminoles Part 2. I'm Dr. Raymond Dunn, your moderator.
And I'm Dr. Marvin Dunn, your commentator. In this episode, we will be discussing the history of the Black Seminoles Part 2. Now, if you haven't heard Part 1, we strongly advise you to take a listen to that part and then pick us up with Part 2.
And with that, let's get started. Welcome to Through Black Eyes Unfiltered Part 2 of the Black Seminoles. Marvin, tell us about the Negro Fort.
Well, in 1814, British established a fort on the Apalachicola River and turned it over to a bunch of escaped slaves and Indians. Now, the Apalachicola River runs down through Georgia into Florida, then all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And the Apalachicola is over sort of near Pensacola, so it's way far west in Florida.
Right.
But the Apalachicola River goes up into the very belly of the South, so it's a major artery for commerce in Georgia and Tennessee and areas in the interior South. It is a very important river. The British, having been kicked out of their colonies, are now still very angry and want to do anything they can to make it difficult for the United States to exist, build this fort on the river, overlooking the river, and they put one cannon there. Mm-hmm. That could be sufficient to stop traffic on the river. And then they leave it in the hands of these black people and Native Americans. The U.S. government hears about this, and they are outraged. You can't have armed black people and Indians in control of a fort that has a cannon overlooking one of the most important commercial waterways in the country. Andrew Jackson sends gunboats to destroy this fort, 1814. Now, mind you, the Negro Fort at this point, there are several hundred black families living there. They have stretched out 2 miles on either side of the riverbank with homes, farms, animals. They're living it's the only free black community in the hemisphere, because Fort Mose, which was near St. Augustine, the old story, first black community in the country, has been destroyed. So at this particular time, the Negro Fort is the only free black community in what's now the United States. And the government has to deal with this situation. So Jackson sends 9 gunboats. They come up the river from the Gulf of Mexico. Fort is about 14 miles up the river from the Gulf of Mexico. Mm-hmm. And the people hear that the government is coming, and everybody comes into the fort. All these people leave their farms along the river banks, and they come into the fort for protection. Sure enough, the gunboats arrive one morning, and there are some untrained artillerists. These black folks don't really know how to use that cannon, and they start exchanging gunfire. On the 9th shot of one of the gunboats, a shell hits the ammunition dump, and the fort is blown up instantly, killing several hundred people, mostly women and children, immediately. Bodies are blown up into the pine trees. This is in the middle of the summer. Mm-hmm. Most of the people died with that first explosion. They were just practicing. It was a practice shot to try to get their range, and they happened to hit the ammunition stores, and the fort blows up, and all these hundreds of people are killed, mostly women and children, as I said. And several people are captured, but that was more or less the end of the attack. I've been there several times. It's very moving to go to this place. It's very, very isolated. It's now a National Historic Site. But where the fort stood, you can still see the earthen embankment, and the spot where that shell exploded has been marked with a flag, so you know exactly where that bomb exploded. And then, Ray, behind what was the fort is something they call the Renegade Cemetery, which is where they buried most of the bodies that they were able to recover. But I was offended when I first went there by the very name of the cemetery, the Renegade Cemetery, which would suggest that these people are dead and buried there because they were renegades. They were living a peaceful life, not bothering anybody until Andrew Jackson sent these damn gunboats up there to destroy them. But it also speaks to how white people saw black people at that moment in our historical past, that if you were doing anything to resist what the government wanted you to do, you were a renegade, and therefore deserving of whatever fate happened to have come your way. The destruction of the Negro Fort led to the movement of many Indians down into Central Florida and even into South Florida. Because when that fort was there, it was a fairly safe environment in North Florida for people who were either escaped slaves or Indians trying to get away from the government. But once the fort was destroyed, it led to the movement of a lot of Native Americans into Central Florida and then eventually down to South Florida.
That's really a sad story, and it makes me want to go and visit.
Well, let me just tell you something, Ray. It's now called Fort Gadsden.
Oh.
They took after this fort was destroyed, here comes now a big entourage of military generals to look at the. I think Jackson wasn't with them. I've forgotten the name of the general who was there. This is a very strategic position that these folks had. So let's rename it Fort Gadsden after the man who Gadsden County is named after.
Right.
Because he was the engineer that they left in charge of it when the government left the fort. Oh, we got this thing under control. We can all leave now. But it became a supply station for the military, for the Army and for the Navy, and was renamed Fort Gadsden. I really want the listeners to understand this because it's one of the best examples of whitewashing black history. It is as if those black people were never there. Even if you go to the park today, that's not a big part of what they tell, of the story they tell about that place. So it's a good example of how they come in and totally wipe out a history, change the name, and all of a sudden what was a very important black community disappears, not just by the fact of the gunboat attack, but by what they did afterwards to wipe out the written history of that community.
But that's why we need to hear these stories through black eyes, unfiltered.
Amen.
That's why. Okay, let's move on to another discussion that I think probably just as interesting. Discuss the reunion of the Black Seminoles in Jupiter.
About every 2 years, they may not do it as often now, but back in the late 70s and in the 80s, every couple of years, there would be a Black Seminole reunion in Jupiter. And why Jupiter? The military had a capacity to bring ships to Jupiter to load the Native Americans, Seminoles and the Black Seminoles on these ships and take them across the Gulf of Mexico to dump them in Texas so they can then be removed to Oklahoma. So Jupiter was a disembarkation point where they sent people out of Florida on military boats to be removed to the west. So for that reason, every couple of years, Black Seminoles would come from Oklahoma, from Mexico, where some of them live, and other places, and assemble themselves in Jupiter for a couple of days just to celebrate their history. And it was very moving the one time that I went to that. I don't know if they still do it.
Very interesting. We have some very interesting stories here about the Black Seminoles. I'm learning so much. I hope that the audience is appreciative of all of this in-depth knowledge.
But you know, Ray, let's do this for the benefit of those who may have missed the first episode. Just for a moment, just tell them who the Black Seminoles were. Some folks may not have caught that. We're talking about in this episode, the Black Seminoles were the black people who were not necessarily of blood relation to the Seminole Indians, but they are people who were formerly either escaped slaves or they were slaves that were owned by the Seminoles themselves, who then intermarried and mixed with the Seminoles, lived with them, and therefore were identified as a part of the tribe, as opposed to escaped slaves who just came in but did not necessarily have any relationship with the Seminole Indians. So the Black Seminoles became a problem for the U.S. government because they were hostile, they were armed, they were working with the Seminoles, and so they became a part of the mission to be removed from Florida.
And at that time, when almost all black people were considered slaves, many of these were considered by some as freed, and that was a problem with the government too, right?
Some of the Black Seminoles could claim that they had been members of the tribe, never having been escaped slaves, never having been owned by anybody. They were free people, and now the government's coming in and trying to remove them without making distinction between which ones were free and which ones were, in fact, escaped slaves. It became very, very difficult for the government to determine, so they just took everybody and sent them back to the chains.
John Horse, whom we spoke of in our first episode of the Seminoles, was a Black Seminole, and his mother was reputed to be a black slave, and his father, it's not proven, was reputed to be a chief by the name of Chevello. So right there, you got a black and an Indian chief. So you do have Black Seminoles with Indian blood in a lot of cases. Let's move on. Marvin, who was and what is the history of John O. Brown?
Dr. John Brown, O'Brown, and now in Miami. The question came up, well, where are the Black Seminoles now? What happened to them in more recent years? Most of them still live out west on reservations where they were removed to, but over the years, some of the Black Seminoles have returned to the South, returned to Florida even. Mm-hmm. And Dr. John O. Brown, who's now deceased, was one of the major civil rights leaders in Miami, in Dade County. He was the president of CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, the civil rights activist organization, which, unlike the NAACP in Miami in the 1960s, CORE was doing the most aggressive demonstrations. They were the ones that were the most difficult to appease. The NAACP had a much more accommodious attitude, shall we say. So John Brown comes in, and he was a Black Seminole. His family was among the Black Seminoles who were removed to Oklahoma. He came here from Wewoka, Oklahoma.
Okay.
And he looked like, he was a racially mixed person who was an ophthalmologist in the Army. He was a captain in the Army and served in World War II. The war is over, and John Brown had been stationed in Miami as a part of his military duty, and he decides to stay in Miami. Then this is now mid-1940s, and as we move into the 50s, John becomes a part of the civil rights movement in Miami. His son was one of the children who was used in the lawsuit to force the Dade County school system to desegregate. So he was a grassroots level leader here, and again, his background was that of the Black Seminoles.
All right.
He was a good man. Just before we leave John, because people don't really know who John Brown was. I met Dr. Brown on many occasions. He would let me come to his home and talk to him and his wife and go over his papers. And people like that, giants like that, who paved the way by just being out there fighting for us. It was John Brown who was a part of the establishment of Virginia Key Beach.
Well, you see, you're talking about Dr. John Brown. Now, that's going to pair up with another individual we're going to talk about, and that is the Reverend Theodore Cannon, because
Gibson,
because he too was involved in the lawsuit to desegregate Dade County School. He too was a part of that weighed in at the beach. So apparently, now I don't know Dr. Brown, but apparently those two activists knew each other.
Oh, yes. There was a very small group of Black people who were activists at the time. John Brown John O. Brown was one, and Theodore Gibson was another.
Okay.
But the point I'm trying to make is that John Brown was a part of that group that did a weighed-in at Haulover Beach in 1946, I think, that forced the county, Dade County, to establish Virginia Key Beach to keep Black folks from going to the white beaches. John Brown was a big part of that.
Let's move to something very interesting. Where is and what is Red Bays, and what does that have to do with Black Seminoles?
Red Bays is on Andros Island in the Bahamas. It's the closest land to Miami, Florida, in the Bahamas. If you were to swim to the Bahamas and just jumped off into the ocean, the first land you'd come to beyond Bimini would be Andros Island and Red Bays. Red Bays was established in the early 1800s by escaped slaves and Black Seminoles who walked or made rafts and managed to drift themselves down to what's now Dade County, to Key Biscayne. A lot of them went there. And then from Key Biscayne, or from the coast of South Florida, they launched themselves into the open ocean and made it to the Bahamas, to Andros Island, the closest land that they could reach, and established a community of Black Seminoles there. And over the period of several decades, other Black Seminoles took the same route, getting to South Florida, and then sometimes with the help of Bahamian fishermen who would be along the coast of Florida fishing, some of these people would get transported to Red Bays. And it exists today. I've been there twice. It's a very isolated community even today. When I went there some years ago, there was one telephone at the post office that everybody used. There was one gas station that didn't take credit cards. The nearest school required the kids to ride almost an hour to get to the school available to them. So they didn't change very much. I was able to meet a woman, she's now passed, whose grandfather, she was very old in her 90s when I met her, but whose grandfather was among the first Black Seminoles that settled in Red Bays. And she told me, Dr. Dunn, our people wanted to get away from Florida, away from slavery, and many of them died trying to get here. And then once we got here, we found the most difficult place that anybody could reach us, and that's where we settled. So they picked a place where ships couldn't come in. It's too shallow, too rocky. So this community of escaped slaves and Black Seminoles existed on Red Bays for quite some time. Mind you, the Bahamas was under the control of the British at this time. And the British didn't even know they were there. They didn't even know that these people were living there for a decade or so. So finally word reached Nassau that, there's some escaped slaves over there living on the west coast of Andros Island, and maybe y'all need to go over and see who these people are. And the government did. And it got into a big issue about whether they were escaped slaves, that is chattel property of white people back in the United States, and should be returned to slavery. But the Bahamian government had to decide whether Red Bay's residents, once they knew they were there, were to be returned to the United States and to slavery. The British said, we're not doing that. So they left the people alone, and the Red Bays exist today still.
So what is the relationship now for those people with the Bahamian government? Are they considered technically Bahamians?
They are Bahamians, oh yes.
Okay.
They're Bahamian citizens. Some of them have gone and settled in Nassau and other parts of the Bahamas, but no, they're recognized as citizens of the Bahamas. Let's just for a moment talk about how the Bahamas even came to be a government. Had it not been for pirates operating in the Caribbean, as in Walt Disney, look, the pirates were all over the Caribbean, all over the Florida Straits. This is back in the 1700s. There was no controlling them. Mm-hmm. So in order to control pirates, the British government established the Bahamas Island government to try to chase down and deal with piracy because of the lawlessness in the Bahamas. And that's how come the escaped slaves like the Black Seminoles and others could get to the Bahamas and be there for 10 years and the government not even know that they were there.
Now, you cannot mention pirates without telling our audience about Black Caesar. Come on, now we're talking about the Indians, I know, but quickly tell them about Black Caesar.
Black Caesar was a slave who was on a ship in the 1600s that got caught in a storm off the coast of what's now Miami. Everybody died but him. He managed to get ashore, rounded up some other stragglers, black men who had been victims of previous storms or escaped slaves, put together a ship's crew and started taking first boats, and then eventually they took a real ship. Killed all the members of the crew except the captain. Black Caesar forced the captain to teach them how to sail the ship, and then they killed him. And then he started pirating along the coast of Florida. One of his
around Naples, right?
No, on this side. On the map today, map of Florida, in the Keys, around Key Largo, above Key Largo, is Caesar's Creek. That was his hangout. So eventually the British government caught him and hung him, burned him at the stake in Williamsburg. But for a while, Black Caesar was a notorious pirate who managed to take a lot of prizes, who was feared by the British, and eventually was executed by them.
Okay, I wanted you to mention that because today when we think of pirates back in history, we always think of pirates as being white.
No. I'm glad
he was the first that we know of, that I know of, black, successful, prominent black pirate.
Oh, let's clear that up. 1/3 of the pirates on pirate ships, not just Black Caesar's ship, but on pirate ships in that period were black men. 1/3 of the people who were pirates were black. You wouldn't know that if you went to Disney World.
But I'm talking about the captain of the ship.
Well, there were other black men who did pirate ships other than Black Caesar. He was just so well known because he was so notorious. He was all over the place.
Okay, sorry about that.
Well, let's go on back to the...
Okay. Now, let's get back to Red Bays because I want to ask you about their unique industry that they have going there. Is it the basket weaving that everybody talks about in Red Bays?
Yes, they have a very unique way of weaving baskets. They use palm fronds, and they mix the weaving with cloth, scraps of very colorful cloth woven into the handle, into the rim of the baskets. Very, very attractive, beautiful baskets. I own about half a dozen of them. And many of the women mainly do the basket weaving, weave rugs and other things, and they sell those. That's the only livelihood other than fishing that people have there. Some of the men are wood carvers coming straight out of Africa. They use mahogany, the most desirable wood, and they sell the wood carvings as a way of making a living.
Very good. Thank you very much. Now, explain to our audience, how did the Black Seminoles end up in Mexico?
The U.S. government began removing them from Florida to Oklahoma. The land that was given to them when the government has to find a place to several thousand people, what land would they give them? Would it be land where you had water and good soil? No.
I don't think so.
No. They gave them the worst land in Oklahoma, the barren land that no one else wanted except the Native Americans out there. And that's where they sent them. And it was difficult for the people to sustain themselves because they couldn't really grow food and take care of themselves. And some of them refused to settle in Oklahoma. And John Horse, among others, began a dialogue, letters, with the president of Mexico. asking if Mexico would establish a settlement to be established of Black Seminoles in Mexico. And the president of Mexico agreed. So even today, we now have in Mexico a Black Seminole settlement that is probably the healthiest of the settlements that we have scattered around the West.
And I think it's called Nacimiento.
That is it.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, we understand that we have a group known as Black Seminoles. We understand that there is a recognized tribe called the Seminole Tribe. Mm-hmm. Does the Seminole Tribe accept Black Seminoles as tribe members?
No.
Why not?
Money.
Money? Why would Indians be fighting over money?
If the Black Seminoles were accepted by the tribe, then they would be entitled to income from casinos. Seminole families get a lot of money from casinos. I don't know the numbers, but it's a lot of money is given to each member of the tribe. Every child, every man and woman is entitled to a certain amount of money that comes in from casinos, and it's a lot of money. In order to be qualified to receive income from casinos, one must be accepted as a member of the Seminole Tribe. The official position of the Seminole Tribe is that the Black Seminoles are not tribal members, that one must be able to show a blood relationship going back several generations to a particular person. Otherwise, you're not a Black Seminole. You see, Ray, this is a different argument, for example, that a Cherokee could make, or a Creek, or a Comanche. Those are tribes that have existed for thousands of years. So you can't just say I'm a black person, I'm now a Comanche. No.
Right.
But the Seminoles didn't even come into existence until the late 1700s. And they were a collection of several tribes, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Creek. Mm-hmm. And that definition leaves a lot of room for who could be a member of the Seminole Tribe. And the Black Seminoles who joined with these Native Americans early on fought with them, lived with them, intermarried in some cases, ultimately were rejected by the Seminoles as being members of the tribe. Now, Ray, I have to add this as I researched this subject. The Seminoles, even though there were some instances of intermarriage between blacks and Seminoles, the Seminole Tribe was opposed to that. The Seminole Tribe really did not want Seminole women marrying black men. They couldn't prevent it. I don't know of any active steps taken to stop it. The Seminoles considered blacks to be less than them. They had the same not the same, but they had racial animus towards blacks as many racial groups did at that time. So any intermarriage, children born to Seminole women and black men were questioned in terms of their legitimate admission to the tribe. So it's been a difficult issue. Even today, the Black Seminoles are still trying to be recognized by the tribe. There are legal issues moving through the courts, but it's been an uphill battle.
I know that we recognize the Seminole Tribe in the state of Florida, and I presume other states, and give them certain amenities like
independent government.
Right,
sovereignty.
They are a sovereign government. Mm-hmm. And you have the Florida tag, for example, that says Seminole Tribe member. And that means that they don't have to do certain things. The point I'm trying to make is, was there ever a time when Black Seminoles got any kind of consideration like that from any of the states that they've lived in? Florida, Oklahoma, any place?
Not that I know of, Ray. The Black Seminoles have been sort of the out group among Native Americans, and I don't know of any efforts to change that. It's a shame too, because if you look at the amount of income that the Seminole Tribe now has in recent years, they have, Ray, more than enough money to share with the few hundred Black Seminoles that we can identify.
Of course.
To me, it's not so much financial that they don't want to have the Black Seminoles be included. It's racial. I don't think they want to be identified officially with black people in their tribe.
Have they forgotten that as a tribe, when they were striving to defend against the white soldiers, and when they got their recognition as the only Indian tribe that never signed a peace treaty with a white man, that all of these Black Seminole leaders that we were talking about, Abraham, John, Horace, all these guys, these were guys who were instrumental in getting the victories that they had against the white man.
The only real victory that the Seminoles had against white men was the Dade Battle, that the Native Americans won, that they destroyed Dade's force. They lost every other encounter. Anytime the Native Americans and the Seminoles ended up confronting or being confronted by U.S. troops, the Indians lost or ran away. So you don't have that many direct confrontations between the government and the Indians. But the thing to remember as we reflect upon what happened to the Black Seminoles is that it took courage to do what they did. For example, we're talking about Red Bay. You stand on the shoreline of Key Biscayne and you look at that ocean and you want to get to the Bahamas, and you don't have the weatherman to tell you whether there's a storm out there or not. You don't have any indication of what's going to be the weather the next day. And you get into a raft that you and some other folks built and you start drifting towards Bahamas. We have no idea how many people died trying to do that. We have no idea how many people were shot and killed by the U.S. government, by the Army, in the attempts to remove the Seminoles from Florida. We just don't know these things. We don't know how many people were just destroyed by the wilderness itself. You're trying to live in wild Florida in the 1800s, and a lot of people just couldn't survive under those circumstances. So I'm very disappointed that here we are many, many years later, still having difficulty understanding and seeing the Black Seminoles treated in the way that they have historically, I think, performed and deserve to be treated.
As we close this episode 2 of the Black Seminoles, let's remind our young listeners of how they might relate this movement of Black Seminoles trying to cross from Key Biscayne over to the Bahamas to current day attempts of Haitians leaving Haiti on shoddy rafts trying to get to the U.S., and many of them died. We can relate that in some cases to the Cubans in the early Cuban movement trying to get here. Those groups did similar things, but here you have blacks who were trying to make that trip a lot earlier than these later groups.
Yes,
Marvin,
absolutely true.
I appreciate all that you have shared with our audience. This will wrap up part 2 of the Black Seminole episodes.
What Ray and I have been talking about today is covered in my book, A History of Florida Through Black Eyes. It's available on Amazon, so I recommend folks take a look at it.
Very soon, within the next couple of weeks or so, they can also pick up my book in audio. It is The Robin That Could Not Sing. And
what's that about?
The Robin That Could Not Sing is a children's storybook, and it tells really the story to children that it doesn't matter whether or not they can do this or that or the other. Just be yourself. We thank you for listening, and we invite you to stay tuned for our next episode that will deal with prominent figures in Miami-Dade County, and we will probably talk about people like D.A. Dorsey, Marvin.
D.A. Dorsey.
Anthony Range.
Anthony Range, Theodore Gibson.
Theodore Gibson. A number of people that our audience will be very, very excited about listening to. Thank you very much for joining us today. We'd like to thank our sponsors, Aris Crown All Natural Products and Clockwork Tracks, for providing our podcast music. Special thanks also to our editor, Track 53, as well as HGAB Studios and MRD2 Media. This has been Through Black Eyes Unfiltered.
You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter at TBE Unfiltered, or go to our website at tbeunfiltered.com.
And when you do, don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe.
See you next week.